Okay, so this is a Hickok oscillator also. It's listed as a model OS-8, which I'm thinking would precede the OS-10 that I've already restored, but there isn't a drawing on this. There isn't a parts list. I haven't seen a manual anywhere, but I did see plenty of discussions for people who have walked this path before me. A lot of people responded. They were pointing them to an OS-8 manual that was an oscilloscope. There's a military oscilloscope, and that OS-8 manual is in Bama. But no matter where I've looked, I haven't seen any documentation for this. Now, one of the discussions on Antique Radio is going back to 2015. Someone posted a drawing for an OS-7 and the earliest versions of the OS-10 schematics, of which there were several. I had encountered two of them in the past, and it looks like to me like there's at least one more because I hadn't seen those drawings before. But there's no drawing on this. The only reason I picked this up is because when I was working on my OS-10, I had encountered conversations about this OS-8. And since then, I really hadn't seen any images anywhere of, of an OS-8. There were plenty of them for the oscilloscope that's also called an OS-8. I think that one's called an OS-8U. This one says it's an AF-RF oscillator, model OS-8. Same model number used by Hickok. That's pretty unusual. This one seems to be in pretty good shape. I don't know if it's been restored in the past. I kind of hoping that it won't be, hoping that it's got all the original parts, but there are some hints that maybe someone has worked in there. I don't know about this, but this is just a plastic lens. It's not glass or anything heavier. This one seems to be glass on it. Looking at this, all of the screws are in place. I've looked on the bottom and the top, and all of the screws are in place. I'm not sure what this thing is all about. Someplace to do some sort of mounting, but haven't seen anything on it. The power cord, I'm not sure if this is the correct time frame or not. It seems kind of small for something in the mid 30s, but maybe not. I mean, when I look at this, it looks kind of Art Deco-y, which would match the time frame, and the cord is rubbery. It doesn't feel hard or plastic. It's kind of a rubber type cord, and it's beginning to fray and crack and stuff like that. So it could be original. I'm kind of anxious to get inside and see what I've got here. What's nice about it is I've got all the knobs. All of the screws are there, and everything turns and works great too. Seems like there is no marker in the middle of this that tells me what frequency I'm at. I don't know if that's missing or if it's guesswork in those days, but I'm gonna open it up and look inside. I did manage to get the cover off of this thing. Um, Man, it's really nice. It needs some cleanup on the top, but on the back it looks almost brand new. It must have been sitting with its back to the wall. The feet on the back of it are still in pretty good shape, but I'm going to show you. The feet on here are actually all gone. This is the bottom of the device. What's left are some studs, and on the inside I can tell that they are soldered to the cover. Anyway, the cover really doesn't look too bad. And that's kind of echoed on here. This thing looks like it's in pretty good shape, and This thing may be original. I mean, mostly original or all original. The tubes are in perfect condition. I haven't checked to see what kind of tubes they are, but they look great. There's only two of them. Very strange, but if you look at the capacitors, they are definitely period. And those resistors are too. And they are really in good shape. This thing has been taken care of. If I find out that all of the parts are original, I am not going to touch this thing. There's a couple of broken wires on here I noticed. For instance, right here, this wire is not connected to that cap. I'm not going to move it, but you can see it's not soldered. It's just touching it. But on this other one over here, this wire off of the top of this other tube is not connected to anything either. If you look at that, and I'm guessing that it was connected to the other terminal on that capacitor right there. I probably won't be touching it. I could restore it, bring it back to life, but I don't think I'm even going to power it on. It'd be a great temptation to do it because everything looks like it's in really good shape. I think that what this video is going to be is to try to reverse engineer a schematic out of it because there isn't one anywhere to be found. So yeah, this will be interesting. I'm going to try to trace everything out without disturbing it very much. You can see here, this is where the oscillators are. I may not even remove that because Hickok likes to do this. I've decided after working on two of these, they like to solder the oscillator coils, the can shut. You know, they don't want you getting in there, and so I won't. Anyway, pretty cool. I got to come up with a plan on what I want to do with this thing. It looks great. It really does. Very happy with this piece. Looking again at this OS-7 schematic, which was provided by Alan Douglas on a post in Antique Radio some 9 years ago, I've decided that this is likely the closest schematic to the OS-8 that's available. I'll trace out the oscillator leaning heavily on this drawing and make corrections where they are needed. I'll start by tracing out the power, starting from the mains, through the line filters, the transformer, the rectifier, and the power filter caps. It looks like this circuit lends itself well to tracing out most everything else by just going through each pin on the tubes and following each through until I hit a dead end. Once those paths are exhausted, I'll just pick out untraced areas surrounding the remaining components until everything is traced out. I'd like to do this without removing the coil housing and avoid moving components around as much as possible. Obviously, the goal is to derive a drawing for the OS-8, and fortunately the OS-7 has been a very close ancestor. In most cases where there are differences, they're either moot or of little significance, but there are some major areas that I'm not quite sure about, and I'm curious whether or not other owners see the same discrepancies in their OS-8s. The first difference is right where the power comes in from the mains. For the OS-7, the drawing indicates that one side hits the power switch first, but my OS-8 is wired to the RFC coil first before hitting the power switch. I'm guessing that this is not a significant difference, though, since the Supreme 189 was wired like this when I traced it out. This next discrepancy is one I could use some input on. We're dealing with power here still, this time with the way the transformer secondaries are wired. Looking at the transformer from right here is the primary connections. This is one of the secondaries that I guess you could call it the high voltage if you wanted to, but according to the drawing it's only 60 volts. And then this is the other secondary carrying the 18 point whatever volts. The other two are just terminations that they use for the pi filter, which is two capacitors inside that red can and that resistor right there. The other two capacitors are line filters, and the other one is a capacitor that comes off this transformer right here. The lead in question comes from this higher voltage secondary down here, and you can see it. It's the black lead right in between there going straight up. You can see where it curves here, comes across, and then ties down on this lead. Well, that is not the ground lead for this secondary. This one is. So for whatever reason, they're tying the two secondaries together rather than taking them to ground, unless the intent was to tie it to this lead, because this is the ground lead, and maybe it just got put in the wrong place. I don't know, but that's a question I have about this. As I stated before, I could use some input as to whether or not this wiring change is a concern. Please leave a comment one way or the other if you have time. This one doesn't appear to be of much significance, but it is a difference. What we find is that the heaters are wired in reverse order. This seems to be related more to the physical layout of the tubes within the chassis more than anything else. The OS-7 apparently had two models, an A and a B, and that model determined how the input jack was wired into the schematic. My OS-8 wound up being wired with option B, and I initially assumed that B was likely a later revision and would be inherited by the OS-8 as its only option. It wasn't until I started cleaning it that I noticed a stamp in the face of my OS-8. There it was marked as an option B, so if I do have any questions about this change, it would be whether or not any of the other OS-8s out there are Series A. This is a strange one. Coming off the control grid, a lead goes in between a resistor and a capacitor. The resistor goes to chassis, and in the OS-7 there is one capacitor that terminates on the switch position connecting to the first coil. In my OS-8 there is a second cap wired to a different coil as well. The first control grid on the 6F7 comes out the cap, and you can see the stem from the cap there. It goes in between a resistor and a capacitor. The resistor has kind of a funky color code. I can't tell what it is. The body is yellow and the top of it is black, but there is no multiplier dot on there unless it happens to be the same color as that body, which would be yellow, I guess. But anyway, the resistor goes to ground, and then you see the capacitor is attached to a wire. We follow that wire down, and it attaches to, it looks like, I can't tell if it's the bottom wafer on that switch, but it's the very last coil or the first coil, depending on how you look at it. It's probably, I guess maybe it's the first coil. And actually it's a connection on the switch platter that goes to the coil. The problem is that I actually have two capacitors at that point. I have two leads, and they connect to two different switch locations, which are presumably attached to two different coils inside this housing here. So I don't know what to make of that. It doesn't sound right to me, but I just want to document it. If anyone has time to look inside their OS-8 to see if they also have a second cap installed there, please leave a message with your findings in the comments so I can make corrections. This is one that I find very questionable, and one where it would seem that the device might work but would produce unexpected results. This switch here allows you to switch between modulation sources. Right now the switch position is in the middle, which is RF only. There is no modulation cut into the system right now. But if I throw the switch one way or the other, in this case I'm throwing it so that it selects this right side, you can see that they're making contact right now there. If I throw it the other way, the other half of the switch is making contact. And what they're making contact to are that green and brown lead, which are connected to the 6F7 tube, to the, I think it's the first grid and the first plate within that tube. So what's connecting there are, on the right hand side is this little coil assembly that you're looking at here. And by assembly, there's actually two subcoils inside there. And that's why there's two connections on each side over here. If you notice, part of this is there's an external jack here that you can bring an external modulation source, and it actually connects to one of the terminations that goes to this small coil, probably barges in over the top on it, which is fine. The left hand side of the switch goes to these leads, not the green and the brown ones, but the red and the yellow one, down this bundle, and they terminate on that coil assembly there. The red one in the middle is one of the wires, and the yellow one on the lower right hand side, selecting the other half of that coil assembly. So all of this is fine until you get to the second coil in this small coil here, which has a termination on the switch. It goes through the coil, and when it emerges on the other side, it comes out on this black wire. And that black wire terminates on the other half of the switch, which is the red lead going down to that other coil. So it's basically hitching a ride down to that termination point on this coil assembly. And I think what should be happening, or at least what it shows is suggested in the OS-7 drawing anyway, is that this should be an independent lead, that black lead. It shouldn't touch that switch half at all. It should just be routed within this bundle, its own separate lead, and it should come down here, and it still connects up to that coil assembly, but on where that top red lead is located. And the reason that it would select that top red, I'm losing my light for some reason, that top red connection is that lead is like a bus that goes through the entire oscillator and connects to the bottom half of every coil assembly in the entire oscillator, except for this one, which I think is just wired wrong. So I think the correct way would be to run a separate wire and connect to that top red terminal that you're looking at there. Again, if other OS-8 owners have time to check inside their chassis, this would be one to look for and leave a comment. This one is also very different. In my OS-8, every place that is shown in the OS-7 to be wired through switch 1 is cut out. In some ways, the wiring arrangement in my OS-8 is reminiscent of how the dB meter was wired in the OS-10 as a separate sub-device. Okay, we're looking at the meter, the back of the meter in this shot, and I want to just trace out the leads. I've gone through it already, and it's it represents another set of differences that between this, the OS-7, and this OS-8. First of all, the meter wires up. Yeah, it goes right into a rectifier. You can see that here. It's kind of like what would be a very, very early selenium type rectifier, I think. But it's some sort of metal oxide. I don't know why. But um, after it leaves there, though, it really doesn't go anywhere other than to this capacitor. And or the OS-7 drawing, it indicates that I think at this point it goes through a switch or some sort of leave from switch 1 or whatever, but that isn't happening here. You can look all over. There are no leads connecting to it. Yeah, it comes in, it hits this little metal oxide rectifier, and then it comes down through the capacitor, and then it hits this resistor here before terminating on an output port. And in the drawing, that output port almost looked like it looked like maybe some sort of socket for a 5-pin, but um, this one there's really only two sets of output ports. The other side has another one of those strange capacitors that you can't really figure out what they are based on the color scheme. And then it goes over to that other port. So uh, yeah, this is vastly different than the way that it's wired on the OS-7. And this is another thing that if someone has the time, it would be nice to have them research it and put something in the comments for me, because I don't think I'm going to try to restore this because too much of it looks great. Um, but I am curious about that. It's kind of strange, but